We're going to have two colloquia tonight. The first is going to be presented by Gary Weiner, who is being advised by Professor Bill Chase. He's being responded to by Mark Bagby, who is over here, and it's going to be on Vachel Lindsay and the Bardic tradition.
Thank you all for coming this evening. I wasn't nervous until I actually got it. Anne was kind enough to help me hand out some small booklets, which include the poetry that I'll be quoting this evening. I'll also be playing the sound file, and that's on page 2, the transcript of it, and it's actually going to be a little bit easier to understand the words if you read along with that sound file. So, again, good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening. I want to start by thanking my advisor, Bill Chase, for his insights and support, and Rusty Dollerman for his always spot-on suggestions. Couldn't have gotten here without either of you. Without both of you, actually. So, tonight I'd like to speak to you about a young man that I've come to know and like a lot. He had a vision for America, a social democracy marked by art, imagination, beauty, spirituality, not religious spirituality per se, but personal spirituality, and high moral character. He worked tirelessly to see this vision take hold, even though he knew it would take generations to happen. He knew he would never see it completed. Tonight, I'd like to speak to you about Vachel Lindsay, American poet and American bard. It was the evening of March 1st, 1914, in Chicago, on top of Orchestra Hall with views of Lake Michigan. Harriet Monroe, the founder and editor of the 2.5-year-old Poetry, a magazine of verse, had invited 150 Chicago luminaries, arts benefactors, and poets for a banquet in honor of the eminent Irish playwright and poet William Butler Yeats, who was on his second visit to the United States and was on the schedule that evening to talk about contemporary poetry. Also on the schedule that evening was a young, little-known poet from Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, Vachel Lindsay, and he was going to recite some of his own poetry after Yeats's comments. Lindsay had had a few poems published about 10 years before, and he had done some self-publishing of some magazines and pamphlets that included illustrations, essays, and poetry. But he was still little known, in spite of the fact that he had gotten some good critical reviews for a poem, General William Booth Enters into Heaven, that was published about a year before in Poetry magazine. Few knew it then, but Lindsay would soon become the most famous American poet of his generation. Yeats stood to give his oratory, but he surprised everybody by dedicating his remarks to Vachel Lindsay, a fellow craftsman, he called him, whose poem Booth Yeats had returned to several times since his arrival in Chicago. You see, Yeats was a guest at Harriet Monroe's home in Chicago, and Harriet Monroe had placed the year-old poetry magazine in which Booth appeared on the bed table in the guest room. Commenting on the poem, Yeats said that it was stripped bare of ornament. It had an earnest simplicity, and it had a strange beauty. Yeats prophesied that the poem would be in the anthologies. Now, what is it that Yeats saw in Lindsay's poetry? Yeats had a perceptual framework that was informed by his long fascination with the Irish bards, with their chanting of poetry accompanied by a harp or a lyre, the position of the Bardic poet in pagan and medieval society, how they created myth from folktales, and how reciting their vast repertoire of poetry across the country helped to create a shared Irish culture. Yeats himself believed in the power of poetry and the obligation of the poet to help reinvigorate Irish society, which had been subsumed by British culture. And it was through chanted recitation, accompanied by a stringed instrument, the psaltery in Yeats's case, that Yeats thought he could best engage the Irish people. When Yeats read Lindsay's poem, several characteristics likely reminded him of a bardic recitation, and at the same time modernist poetry. The first thing he would have noticed was that the poem, even though it was printed, was oral, A-U-R-A-L. It had headings and side notes to indicate how the poem should be recited or chanted, and what musical instruments should accompany it. It was to be chanted to the meter of a well-known hymn, and it used onomatopoeic language. It was a poem that used an earthy and common language, accessible to all, Lindsay wrote about walking lepers, prostitutes from the alleyways, drug fiends, and vermin-eaten saints with moldy breath. The people who made up the underbelly of society that General William Booth, who had founded the Salvation Army, was trying to save. This was picturesque language that was accessible to all. The poem also used well-understood folk themes. The celebration in heaven was a small-town parade marching down Main Street and past the courthouse. And the saints who were there to welcome Booth were anxious that the parade begin. They were anxious and they were ready for him to arrive. So this was all very understandable to the people who heard the poem. But the poem also delivered a message of hope and renewal. Those on the margins of society, the drug fiends and prostitutes, all were transformed when they arrived in heaven, transformed to archetypes of perfect beings, athletes, sages, sibyls. It was all strangely beautiful. When Lindsay got up to recite, it was late. It had been a long evening of dinner, poetic accolades, introductions, and then the guest of honor. Some guests were already on their feet, ready to leave. When Lindsay stood, like the picture on the front of the book that I handed out, one hand on his hip, one hand high in the sky, and his head held thrown back. He began to recite, and you can all follow along on page 2.
Big bass drums, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? And the saint smiled gravely and he said, "He come, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?" Walking lepers followed rank on rank, lurching bravos from the ditches dank, draft from the alleyways and blood seemed pale, mind still passion-ridden, soul powers frail, garment eaten saints with moldy death, unwashed legions with a weight of death. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
So that was done in 1931, in the year of his death, and no one really knows now what he sounded like at the height of his poetic power. But it was something that the audience had never heard anything like before. They were carried away by Lindsay's performance and encored for more. Harriet Monroe recalled years later, the night which for the Irish poet was one of many such occasions, was a triumph for the young poet of Illinois. And Lindsay himself called it the artistic transformation event of his life. For the next 17 years, Lindsay would travel around the country, reciting his poetry to an audience that some have estimated at up to 4 million people. He played colleges and high schools, civic clubs and women's groups. The people loved his recital, but the critical response was rather mixed. Some thought Lindsay was a genius. Yeats did. Poet and biographer Edgar Lee Masters did. Ezra Pound was in the other camp. He thought Lindsay was a yahoo, a bumpkin. Today, Lindsay receives only a trickle of scholarly attention. And that's a shame. There was really so much to like about Lindsay. When he is the object of scholarly attention, he is most remembered for his style of recitation, his great popularity, for the long walks he took across the country, for his gospel of beauty, his program to reinvigorate American democracy, and his decidedly mixed legacy. Those who do write about Lindsay often call him a bard. Now, the term bard is sometimes just a synonym for poet, but at other times it's meant to signify a poet of particular note. And Lindsay is called a bard because of his socio-political program and his overarching boosterism of America. But I contend that Lindsay is bardic at a far deeper level. His poetry is bardic. His aesthetic is bardic. He used bardic genre, myth, heroic praise, elegy, imprecation or curse, and prophecy. His view of the role of poet and poet in society was bardic, and his use of poetry to rouse America, to overcome challenges to the way of life that he saw were part of the ideals of America, that was bardic as well. And his poetry was consistent with a modernist bardic archetype that had developed in successive iterations by Elizabethan, Romantic, and modernist poets. And Lindsay, he was a warrior poet. Tonight I'd like to take a selection of Lindsay's poetry, which together form sort of a bardic narrative, a bardic arc, if you will, that covers some of the major genres of bardic expression: mythology, heroic elegy, cultural advocacy, prophecy, and the building of warrior souls. And I want to focus specifically on the power of poetry and the role of the poet in society. But first I need to give you a little background about the bards, and then tell you what was troubling Lindsay in 1914. The historic Celtic and Saxon bards were members of an aristocratic hereditary caste. They were held in such high regard that whatever a bard might ask, it would be granted. And a poet stepping between two warring factions was enough to guarantee peace. The bards studied for years in Bardic schools, the origins of which are lost to antiquity. But over the course of a 12-year curriculum, the prospective bards would memorize about 1,000 poems, whose length together was about equal to 1.5 times the combined lines of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that didn't count the poetry that they themselves composed. And nothing was permitted to be written down, not even during the process of composition. They studied history and land lore. They learned the art of prophecy and satire. Some bards were attached to noble houses, where they composed poems that praised the heroic exploits of the clan and the lord's noble lineage. They would attend important functions, weddings, and funerals. Other bards wandered from village to village, picking up folk tales, composing poems about them, and reciting those as they crossed the countryside, thus creating a shared culture. The people, especially the young, would sit rapt, listening to bardic recitations, and they would dream warrior dreams. Elizabethan poet Michael Drayton was the first to create a bardic archetype, adding what was known of bardic history to his own perceptions of the poet. Drayton believed that the long line of hereditary bards who passed down poetry from one generation to another must have been among the very first to receive the divine inspiration of poetry. And he believed that that divine inspiration was still with them, undiluted, unadulterated. He saw the bards as protectors of druidic wisdom, and that way they were the storehouse of cultural knowledge. He was impressed with the high regard that the poets were held in the society, and he called them the perfect pattern of the poet. Romantic poet Thomas Gray, in his very influential poem, The Bard, pictured on the back of the booklet, evolved the bardic archetype. Gray's poem was originally conceived as a statement of the right of poets to stand up to tyranny, but it languished unfinished for many years because Gray felt that the contemporary situation of poets in Britain did not live up to his ideal. When it was finished, though, the poem talked about an old risen bard, the last survivor of his Welsh poetic fraternity, standing on a rocky outcrop above the Conway raging flood, his hair and beard blowing in the wind horizontal like a meteor or the tail of a comet, a celestial omen of doom. He spat curses down on Edward I, whose forces had murdered all the poets for fear that they would spread sedition and rebellion among the Welsh people. Edward's troops stood frozen in confusion and fear at the angry bard hurling curses at them. But Gray's bard was not merely a storehouse of cultural knowledge. He was an avenger. He was calling the ghosts of his murdered brethren to help him weave a prophecy that would end Edward's line, and foretelling the rebirth of the poetic fraternity in the spirit of the great 6th century bard Taliesin. The bard knew he would not live to see his prophecy fulfilled, and he fell to Edward's forces. Yeats evolved the role of the poet bard further, where Drayton saw the bard as a storehouse of cultural knowledge, and Gray saw the bard as prophesizing a culture's reemergence. Yeats used poetry as an active agent in the reinvigoration of his culture. Yeats started the Abbey Theatre in Dublin as a venue to make literature available to the whole of the Irish people in its 3 great forms: narrative, lyrical, and dramatic poetry. And the poetry was to be chanted or sung, as Yeats said, without the mediation of print and paper. Yeats updated the archetype with common and accessible language, and hoped through his poetry to remind the Irish of their cultural legacy. So it's easy to see how Bard came to be considered the voice of his nation, and how the voice of the nation came to be the predominant and actually preeminent requirement for a modern bard. That was certainly how Walt Whitman saw the situation and interpreted the role of bard in the introduction to his 1855 Leaves of Grass, and in the anonymous review he wrote of his own work, where he declared himself an American bard at last. Now, what was troubling Lindsay in the first quarter of the 1900s? Industry and commerce were luring people to the cities. The prairie towns and agricultural communities were being hollowed out. States' rights were being reduced as the federal government grabbed for more power. Money bought influence, and big business controlled the press. and the press came down hard on anyone who argued against centralization. Actually, it doesn't sound too different than 100 years later, America in the early 2000s. Within a few years, a new word, babbitry, would be coined to describe the mindless conformity and focus on wealth for wealth's sake, which was gripping the nation. It comes from Sinclair Lewis's 1922 novel, Babbitt, and Lindsay himself appears in that book, somewhat. Babbitt enters his daughter's room while she was out to see what she's up to, and discovers she's been reading poetry by Lindsay, which shows a spirit of rebellion against niceness and solid citizenship, and discontent with the common good ways. So how did Lindsay respond? With poetry. Lindsay understood the power of poetry, and he had a bardic aesthetic. In one early notebook, Lindsay showed a fascination with the bardic poets, and with his own ancestry, which he believed linked him to the Saxon poets. Lindsay wrote, and I'm quoting, "He whose dream of poetry is worthy of his Saxon kind is the one who seeks to chant a saga as fiery and bold as those of the graybearded in the house of Beowulf." And Lindsay was not speaking metaphorically. He was not talking about some imaginary poet. It was rather his conception of himself as a poet. Quiet lyrical poetry, read in quiet moments, was not the kind of poetry Lindsay wanted to write. Lindsay intended to write about heroes and heroic achievements. In the halls of the Saxon thanes, the heroes were warriors, and the lauded feats were great victories in battle. But Lindsay understood he was going to be composing for a 20th century audience who first would approach the poetry with rationality, and only then with emotion. He wrote that he would be composing lyrics for those who learn courage through the chosen words of the battle cry, who cannot feel unless they first understand. Lindsay needed heroes, and he needed a battle cry that would motivate America, mainly the young, to accomplish great deeds in the arts, in government, and in furtherance of democratic ideals. And Lindsay's battle cry was something he called the gospel of beauty, which we will get to a bit later. So tonight I'm going to discuss 3 poems. In praise of Johnny Appleseed, the poet takes a well-known folk tale and makes it part of America's cultural legacy. In the Gospel of Beauty, he lauds an American heroic archetype, he warns of danger to an American way of life, and he prophesizes America's redemption. And in Virginians Are Coming Again, Lindsay finally finds his true warrior voice. So, with the first poem, In Praise of Johnny Appleseed, Lindsay creates a new founding myth that arose in the Eden-like forests of the Midwest. He believed there was something mystic in the very land of America that was part of the nation's soul. The East, where America had begun, had metaphorically lost its vitality. Attention drawn from the land to the cities, from the hard labor of settlement and farming, to the somewhat easier task of commerce. Everything in the East had become domesticated, perverted. And Lindsay gives a succession of vignettes in which animals escaping west across the Appalachian barricade, nourished in the Midwestern forests, are transfigured back to their essential wildness, their essential natures. So, Lindsay writes, colts jump fence, snorting, ramping, snapping, sniffing with gastronomic calculations, cross the Appalachians, the east wall of our citadel, and turn to gold-horned unicorns. The gold in their horns show the true value, the true wealth comes from the land, not the commerce that was being pursued in the East. That was guilt, not gold. Puppies became ravening wolves. Cats became tiny tigers. And pigs became foaming wild boar. It's the same transfiguration metaphor that Lindsay used in Booth, where those on the edges of society had vixen, fox-like faces, but they were transfigured to their true essences when they entered into heaven. They were transfigured into kings and prophets and athletes as they accompanied Booth into the heaven that resembled small-town America. But hidden in these series of anecdotes is evidence of Lindsay's bardic aesthetic and self-image. There among the creatures who escaped their domesticity, the haughtiest swans and peacocks swept west, and despite soft derivations crossed the Appalachians and turned to blazing warrior souls of the forest, singing the ways of the Ancient of Days. Here Lindsay is speaking of poets, not animals. Swan, a term for bard or poet, has been applied to Virgil, the Mantuan swan, and to Shakespeare, the Swan of Avon. Lindsay describes these swan poets as peacocks, as haughty, self-absorbed, and prideful, suggesting lyric poetry and lyric poets. They have soft derivations, suggesting urban lives limited by commerce, not the manual labor and other privations of farming and required of homesteaders. And when these swan poets cross to the Eden-like Midwest, they transfigure to their true, blazing warrior souls, becoming more like the bards in the hall of Beowulf. In Lindsay's aesthetic, not only do poets have warrior souls, but warriors have poet souls. Lindsay writes, and the old Continentals in their ragged regimentals with bards' imaginations crossed the Appalachians. The Continentals, citizen warriors who fought for American independence, are celebrated for their poetic imaginations, their dreams of accomplishing great things, setting up a further contrast between Lindsay and the haughty lyric poets that he mentioned in the Johnny Appleseed poem. And Johnny Appleseed is also a new founding myth for America. The children's tale goes something like this. Johnny Appleseed, a bit daft, went around the country scattering apple seeds, and that's why America has so many apple orchards. But Lindsay saw in Appleseed a new founding myth, a shorthand for his vision for America, of America's special destiny. So Appleseed becomes an alchemist, a magician, and in his backpack are the fruit orchards of the future, seeds and ghosts, the not yet born and the already long gone. Lindsay writes, the beautiful orchards of the past, the ghost of all the forests and groves, in that pack, on his back, in that talisman sack, seeds and tree souls, precious things. And what do these apple seeds and ghosts of past orchards create when they touch the fecund soils of the Midwest? He writes, an angel in each apple that touched the forest mold, a ballot box in each apple, a state capitol in each apple, great high schools, great colleges, all America in each apple. Appleseed is reimagined as an orchard god, an American pomona, barrels of apple and other fruit his cornucopia, preparing the way for the pioneers and settlers who would tend the Eden-like gardens of the Midwest and build a nation. Next, I want to discuss the gospel of beauty, Lindsay's program for redressing the trends that he saw as threatening traditional American values. The first part of the gospel is an elegiac celebration of his maternal grandfather, Ephraim Samuel Frazee, whom Lindsay names the proud farmer, a noble and heroic American archetype. It is reminiscent of how the bards who were attached to noble families praised the nobility's family lines, the ancient ancestral lines. Lindsay writes, into the acres of the newborn state he poured his strength and plowed his ancient name, and when the traders followed him he stood, towering above their furtive souls and tame. The farmer works the very same lands that Appleseed trod, that mystic source of American exceptionalism, infused with farmer sweat and his ancient lineage. He's a far more imposing figure than the traders who come, making their living from trade, not from labor. And unlike the animals and poets in Johnny Appleseed, the traders undergo no transfiguration. Lindsay has said it is their souls that are furtive. They are already expressing their true natures. The ancient bards celebrated their heroes with lists of their accomplishments and lists of their attributes. And Lindsay does the same. Despite his severe countenance, the proud farmer welcomes guests with talk and joke and fellowship to spare. The hero is inquisitive and interested in worldly affairs, lining his walls with books from everywhere. He believed in democratic values, and he was noble in attitude. He venerated God, and he tended to a spiritual flock, as well as to his land. He was a leader in his community. He helped to build churches, schools, and roads, and the community was less for his passing. But the farmer left a legacy, and since the farmer was Lindsay's grandfather, Lindsay was speaking about his own inheritance when he said, yet do they think of that bright light he burned. Yet do they think of that bright lamp he burned, a family worth and proud integrity, and many a sturdy grandchild bears his name, in reverence spoken, till he feels akin to all the lion-eyed who build the world, and lion dreams begin to burn within. Grandfather Frazee was not unlike the hero celebrated in the halls of the Saxon bards. And it was in Lindsay's aesthetic to praise him, and in so doing, to inspire others to dream Mayan dreams. In the second part of the gospel, the poet laments the disappearing Illinois village, the prairie towns and agricultural communities that were being hollowed out by the lure of industrial and commercial jobs in the growing Midwest cities. It was an existential threat that Lindsay saw to the core values of the American nation. While agrarian communities had land in which that mystical presence existed, urban communities had sidewalks and pavement. Rather than the symbiosis of land and family, or land and pioneer ethos implied in the proud farmer, the city was parasitic. Its sidewalks were a source of fear. Lindsay calls to those who left the small prairie towns, who had become disillusioned by the cities. And he asked them to look back to the small agricultural communities that they had come from, because hope was still there. He says, "O you who lose the art of hope, whose temples seem to shrine a lie, whose sidewalks are but stones of fear, who weep that liberty must die, turn to the little prairie towns, your higher hope shall yet begin." The glory that created this country, the legacy of all those proud farmers, still existed in these towns. But Lindsay lamented that all the young people were leaving, going to the cities, and those remained long to follow. They had lost imagination. They were not building monuments to the future. Lindsay says that the young women who gathered off the railway platform every Sunday afternoon to see the trains go by, going to the cities, and wishing that they could be on them, that instead they should have been muses, inspiring artistic imagination in their lovers, and in the process so enjoying life that the city is forgotten. He says, "This beauty calls for valiant song, for men to carve these fairy forms and faces in a fountain freeze, dancers that own immortal hours, painters that work upon their knees, maids, lovers, friends, so deep in life, so deep in love and poets' deeds, the railroad is a thing disowned, the city but a field of weeds." Again, Lindsay shows up in his own poem, like a director who does a cameo in his own film. He speaks to his idea of himself as a warrior poet who can encourage others to do heroic deeds. He says, "Who can pass a district school without the hope that there may wait some baby heart the books shall flame, with zeal to make his playmates great?" If you know a lot about Lindsay, you see Lindsay in that. In the last part of the Gospel of Beauty, Lindsay reveals his prophecy and speaks of the building of Springfield, a mystic city of imagination, art, and beauty, and personal spirituality. Springfield was Lindsay's beloved hometown, and the model for all the mystic cities he hoped would dot America. Now, prophecy is an important characteristic of the Bardic archetype. The Celtic bards learned the art of seership in the Bardic schools. Thomas Gray prophesies the fall of the Plantagenet line. Whitman's introduction to the Leaves of Grass, basically a primer for American bards, says that prophecy is one of the characteristics of the American bard. And Yeats prophesied that Lindsay's poetry would be in the anthologies. I'd like you to recall for a moment Thomas Gray's bard, the wizened poet who defied Edward I. That poet knew he must die. He could not defeat Edward in his own lifetime. He knew that it would be many generations before his prophecy could be fulfilled, and Lindsay realized the same. He was under no illusion that he could save village life, but he did believe in the resurrection of village ideals. Lindsay saw a future of small cities dedicated to art and learning and beauty and democracy. He likens the future city of Springfield to other small cities that were nevertheless major centers of art and poetry and learning. And he says, "Let not our town be large, remembering that little Athens was the muse's home, that Oxford rules the heart of London still, and that Florence gave the Renaissance to Rome." And like Gray's bard, he knows his vision will take generations to achieve, and he says, "Record it for the grandson of your son. A city is not builded in a day. Our little town cannot complete her soul till countless generations pass away." The vision was of a city where modern technology, industry, and commerce was subjugated to imagination and art and beauty. And Lindsay imagined an artistic meritocracy He said, "Let no man rule who holds his money dear." And the land remained a mysterious source of power and a source of American values. In Lindsay's Mystic City, students from afar would come, they would sit in the parks, the beautiful parks, the nurturing parks, and he says that students from afar would choose to starve in those parks rather than go home. And when the prophecy is fulfilled, Lindsay thought the city would be filled with music, and poetry would be its lifeblood. He again emphasizes the poet's place in the culture and poetry's power. And actually, it's poetry that will lead its way to the fulfillment of the prophecy. He says, "When will they start our vulgar blood athrill with living language, words that set us free? When will they make a path of beauty clear between our riches and our liberty?" The final poem I want to cite tonight is "The Virginians Are Coming Again." It's an important departure from other works we've discussed this evening. In the earlier poems, Lindsay addressed his constituency, the people that he spoke to. He was didactic, but with "The Virginians Are Coming Again," Lindsay speaks directly to his enemy, the forces of Babbittry. And with this poem, Lindsay finally finds his warrior voice. Now, "The Virginians Are Coming Again" was written in 1928. Lindsay had been preaching his gospel of beauty for 15 years. He was frustrated with the lack of attention that his program was getting. He was frustrated even with his audiences, who continually demanded that he recite the Congo or Booth, poems he was very proud of, but really had nothing to do with his vision for America. And he was frustrated on how he was being received by the critics. So it was time to address the enemy directly. "Babbitt, your tribe is passing away. This is the end of your infamous day. The Virginians are coming again." And Lindsay is speaking to the entire nation of Babbitts, and therefore he's declaring a genocidal war on materially consumptive and closed-minded America. Although Lindsay describes his enemies in animal and subhuman-like terms, there will be no transfiguration here like there was in Booth and Appleseed. Babbitt's animal natures are their true natures. Lindsay says, "Your faces like geese and foxes, geese for the conforming multitudes, the conforming gaggles, and foxes for the sly ones seeking only individual gain." And Babbitts are described as some subhuman creatures, short-legged, short-armed, while the Virginians are described in virile terms, gentlemen, hard-riding, long-legged men. Once Lindsay declared open warfare, he denigrated his enemy, stripping him of any admirable human characteristics. Now, imprecation and curse, as I've said earlier, was an important weapon of the bards and the enemies of the people and of the culture. And Lindsay invokes a series of particularly dire curses on the Babbitts. He says their sons will reject everything their fathers stand for. "Your sons will be changelings and burn down your world. Fire eaters, troubadours, conquistadors. Your sons will be born refusing your load." The sons will reject not just their fathers, but also their father's world. They will be individuals, not conformists like their fathers, and they will refuse their father's load, that burden that fathers often put on their sons to maintain the same beliefs or to follow in a preferred profession. They will be individuals, not conformists like their fathers, and they will refuse their father's load. I just said that, excuse me. The sons of Babbittry will reject narrow-mindedness in favor of education, becoming scholars, sensitive and caring. And they will be hard-riding men, just like the Virginians, and not at all like their fathers. And importantly, Lindsay inflicts on the Babbitts a near Oedipal fate. He says that Babbitt's defeat will emanate from his own loins. And Lindsay gives that added significance by starting 3 sentences with that phrase, each of those sentences starting the last line of a stanza. So Lindsay envisions the Virginians as champions of poetry, the embodiment of the warrior poet. He describes them as bards of the Blue Ridge in buckskin and boots. And the sons of Babbitt, he says, will also be bardic. He calls them poets unharnessed, the moon their abode. Unlike their fathers, they'll compose the loftiest dreams in poetry. Now, in Gray's The Bard, poets ultimately triumph. He prophesied the return of the order of the bards with the spirit of Taliesin. And in The Virginians Are Coming Again, Lindsay also prophesies poetry's ultimate triumph. The song itself will deliver the death blow. He says, "The old grand manner, lost no longer, exquisite art, born with heart-bleeding song, will make you die horribly, raving at wrong." Lindsay gave no quarter. He devotes the entire last stanza of the poem to the power of poetry to incite. Lindsay had an implicit understanding of the power of poetry, as evidenced in the college notebooks he started 30 years before. There he wrote about the power of the Saxon bards, and he wanted to incite the warrior heart. And how even in Lindsay's time, there were bold hearts who loved above all else, quote, the great chant that comes like the roll and reel of 10,000 martial drums, speaking nothing to them, but that the joy of the battle coming is greater than any revel that has passed. So Lindsay also recognized that there were many who first needed to understand before they could act. And it was for them that Lindsay originally wanted to write his poetry. But with the Virginians are coming again, Lindsay forsakes didactic for the bellicose. He writes, rouse the reader to read it right, find a good hill by the full moonlight, gather the boys and chant all night, the Virginians are coming again. Put in rhetoric, whisper and hint, put in shadow, murmur and glint, jingle and jangle this song like a spur, sweep over each tottering bridge with a whir, clearer and faster up Main Street and Pike, till sparks flare up from the flints that strike, leap metrical ditches with bridle let loose. This song is a war with an iron-shod use. Lindsay places the poet in the heart of the battle for America. The poet gathers and rouses the troops. He chants in Lindsay's own style, using words to teach and convince, and modulating his recitations with whispers and sharps. He likens the poets to the avenging Virginian on horseback, the poem given enough head to clear any rhythmic obstacles. He whips the avenging forces to a frenzy with a galloping iambic tetrameter, where meter combines with words and imagery to encourage an increasingly rapid recitation as the stanza progresses. In each of these poems, Lindsay says something about the role and power of poets in poetry. That belief that a society should value its poets and that poetry plays a critical, crucial cultural role, that a poet should stand up to tyranny both inside the nation and outside the nation, is a belief that was shared by all the other poets that I cited this evening. They each acted on that belief, either in the process of composition or directly working to have a beneficial impact on the people for whom they spoke. In that way, and in many other ways not discussed this evening, Vachel Lindsay is bardic at a far deeper level than scholars normally give him credit for. Thank you.
Gary, that was an excellent presentation. I think you really did justice to your written thesis, which was also very excellent too. And a personal thank you for introducing me to Lindsay, especially our conversations on Johnny Appleseed. So I have 3 questions tonight. I'm a big fan of Yeats, and somehow I feel that I should have known something about Lindsay, but I didn't know about him until you started talking about your thesis topics. In your thesis, you quote from Harriet Monroe's 1938 book, Poet and Their Art, that Lindsay was, quote, the best and farthest known of all our American poets of this vocal decade. It seems to me that his fame and sadly his life kind of went out with the whimper. His tombstone only reads his name and poet. If Lindsay was once one of the most famous poets, why is he now almost forgotten?
So there are 3 reasons. The first is that Lindsay's poetry was primarily performance poetry, and unfortunately there was not a legion of Elvis impersonators to pick up after Lindsay died. The second reason is that his opus, his oeuvre, is mixed. There's a lot of stuff which is really not so good in there. There's maybe 10 to 15% of his poetry which I would say shows his genius, and about another 10 or 20% that's really good. And I think this mixed poetry, this mixed bag of quality, lack of technical merit, really turned a lot of scholars off to him. The third reason, there are always 3 reasons. The third reason is that even while he was performing his poetry and writing his poetry, the America he was talking about was already on the way out. By 1920, the 1920 census showed that more people were in the cities than on the farms and in the rural areas. This was the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. You can't talk about that decade, that era, and be arguing against wealth. It just doesn't go over very well. And I think those are the main reasons. Now, from about 1950 to 1975, there was a relatively large resurgence in Lindsay scholarship, and that was at a time when I think folk history, folk tales became an area of serious scholarly attention, and Lindsay came back into fashion in that time frame. So those were the main reasons why his poetry really doesn't survive.
Great, thanks. In your presentation, you speak about Lindsay's vision of cities of art, beauty, and spirituality. In your thesis, you mentioned that Lindsay had visions, even at one time he had a vision of Jesus, I think you mentioned. Is his mystic city vision an idea, a religiously inspired imagination, or something more like a revelation? And did these visions have a minor or a major impact on his poetry?
So, first I'll say, clearly, there's no way of knowing what Lindsay experienced. It could have been dreams, it could have been hyperactive, spiritual, religious imagination. He was diagnosed, I'm not sure if it was 23 or 28, but he was diagnosed with epilepsy, which could have caused the hallucinations, or it could have been revelation, don't know. But he started getting his visions about 1904 and 1905. The most important vision, which really informs his work, was in 1906 on the ship coming back from a tour. Before he was a famous poet, this was more like a grand tour of Europe. He woke in the middle of the night from a vision, and he said that he had 3 stanzas of the poem, I heard Emmanuel singing, already written in his mind. And the vision was of Jesus after the second coming in the mystic city of Jerusalem, which had descended from the heavens, relaxing on a grassy knoll, which might have been a park, playing his harp and singing, pleased that everything was new and everything that was old was gone. And that really was the core of his mystic city. But it was also informed in a very rational way. When Lindsay was in New York studying art and then poetry at a school called the Chase School, Lindsay had to work in order to help pay the bills. And some of the time he was giving lectures and tours at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he talks about seeing artifacts and little models of places like Rome and Athens and Florence. And he was also very interested in the architecture of New York. He was fascinated with the Flatiron Building, which is a great building, but in 1914 there was nothing else around it, nothing big. And there's a big park called Madison Square Park right next to it. So he started seeing these things and started asking himself, why can't Springfield do that? And so this vision of a mystic city began to flesh itself out with intellect, with rationality.
Final question. Lindsay was known for his long walks across America. He described his walks of 1906, 08, and 1912, when he covered a lot of ground in the South and the Midwest, and I think on the Prairie. As some of you here know, Gary is quite the walker himself. You've walked hundreds of miles on the Pilgrim Trails in Europe. How did Lindsay's walks affect his poetry? And have you found any connection with Lindsay because of your own walks?
Yeah, that's good. So I won't take the time to say how I got to Lindsay, but certainly walking was part of that. There were 3 things that Lindsay got out of the walks. One, he got that sine qua non, that without it you can't do, knowledge of the nation, knowledge of the people, which is the prerequisite for the Bardic poet. On his last walk from Springfield to New Mexico, he got up early in the morning, he started walking, and he was hearing the song of a bird called the Rachel Jane. But as the sun came up, all these automobiles were streaming westward, and they drowned out the poetry of the bird. And somehow, however that linked in his mind, he began to think about setting a poem, to find the meter of a poem in a well-known hymn or a well-known song. So that came to him on the walk. And let's see. Oh, the third thing that came to him on his walk, he had gone through a stretch where he had a couple of bad audiences, so to speak. I mean, his audiences were the people, he was trading poems for bread. Right? He worked if he had to. He did the wheat harvest in Kansas, he chopped wood. he begged, but basically he was trading his poetry for room and board. And it must have been a week or so that he really had some bad audiences, some bad experiences. And then one night in Colorado, he was graciously given a room in this family's home, and he was reciting some very trivial poetry to the two children in the house. And he was doing things that make kids happy. He was making faces, he was jumping around, he was just making the kids happy while he was reciting his poetry. Those kids would not leave him alone. And the realization came to him that this was the way to engage people in poetry, to make it entertaining. So those three things definitely came from his voice. Oh, and me. Okay, so two aspects of pilgrimage walking that I experienced and that I saw in Lindsay is liminality and communitas. So liminality is when you start something, you're no longer what you were, and you're not yet what you're going to be when you finish. You're somewhere in between. You're not really yourself. And communitas is this shared experience that you have. And so Lindsay had this. When he left New York to start his first walk, he took a boat down to Florida and walked to Kentucky. He was not the same person anymore. In fact, he said that it was the only time he felt alive was when he was on that walk. And he remembers very distinctly the recitals he did in the log cabins in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where he recited and he saw the faces of the people that in his audience, small audience, that were only illumined by the hearth. And he said he continually refers to that experience. So I think the liminality and the communitas is something that I experienced to a great degree on my walks. Great. John.
Yeah, fascinating, thanks. To what extent was he influenced by Walt Whitman and William Morris? And when he went on his European Grand Tour, where did he go and what were the most striking experiences for him?
Well, the most striking experience, I think, because I've seen it in his poetry, he was really impressed with the walls of Nuremberg. And that shows up actually in, I forget which poem it is, but it shows up in his poetry. So that really impressed him. You asked what he thought about Morris and
Whitman and William Morris.
Okay, so he wrote a really insightful article in the Saturday Evening Post. And there was a question put to him whether he thought Whitman was a hero. And he said, no, Whitman's not a hero. A hero is someone who you emulate. Basically, if you emulate Whitman, you're dead. There's no way that you can create a poetic self if you're trying to emulate Whitman. So Whitman was not a hero, but he did think very highly of Whitman. In terms of Morris, yes, he going one step before Morris, he had read the Stones of Venice, Bridges of Venice, Morris's work on
Stones of Venice.
Sorry, what is
The Stones of Venice.
Stones.
Ruskins.
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
but Morris.
yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, so he had lectured on that at the YMCA, and he believed in Morris's view that this conformity, this constant flow of things which are not great, which are kind of mediocre, was a real detriment to the working man. And it shows up in his poetry. It shows up. He gave a lecture after the race riots of Springfield in 1908. He gave a lecture to a union hall in Ridgely, just outside of Springfield, where he was really talking about race relations. But he moved quickly from that to the fact that working men, labor, would never be free unless they could first develop their imagination and their sense of beauty and art. So Morris was a direct impact. Also, Lindsay wrote a book, his only book, which is a utopian fantasy called The Golden Book of Springfield. And there's a lot of Morris in that book. The city that he sees there is a medieval city with towers and artisans, and it comes right out of Morris's News from Nowhere. So they both had impacts on him. Yes, please.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm just curious, could you do a little brief biographical scan of Vachel's life? Because did he live in Springfield all his life, or was he ever in New York, or where?
Okay, so he was born in 1879. He grew up in a religious but not oppressively so household. His mother was quite educated. She was a teacher. His father was a country doctor. He went to medical school at Hiram College, but he followed his father's profession, his father's load, if you will, and he gave that up for first illustration and then poetry. He went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and then he went to the Chase School of Art in New York. In New York, he tried to sell his poetry on the streets, a penny or two per poem. It was not very successful. And that's when he decided to do his walking. And there's a history behind the walking as well, but too much time to go into that. His last major walk was in 1913. He wrote Booth. Then he was introduced in Poetry Magazine, and from there things began to take off. He went to Europe again in 1920 after the war. He had a wonderful reception at Oxford. There were 3 or 4 current or past or future Nobel laureates in the group, and they just went crazy over his recitation. He was very close to his mother. His mother was domineering. It should be pointed out that Lindsay was celibate until he got married at probably the age of 45 or so. That was partly his father's doing and partly his mother's doing, just in terms of what they instilled in him. His mother died in 1922. He had a nervous breakdown. There were some problems with the will. They took away his beloved family home in Springfield, the home that actually Mary Todd Lincoln's sister had lived in before, so there's a lot of history in that home. He went down to, I forget the name of the college, Gulfport College in Mississippi, where he was a resident poet and scholar for about a year, but there was no chemistry there. He left for Portland. He married Elizabeth, I forget her last name, who he had known actually when she was a relatively younger child. She was 20 years his junior. She had introduced him to a poetic recital at Mills College, and then he found her again in Spokane. Spokane was not very accommodating to him. They wanted him to write poetry in a certain way. But all this time he was traveling through America. He was exhausted. He was, you know, one thing about being an American bard, it doesn't pay very well. When he died, he owed $4,000 and he had $75 in his pocket. So it's a sad story. I probably could put on more, but it's... Yes, Charles.
Wonderful, Jared, thank you. I'm curious, did Yeats retain his estimation of Vachel Lindsay?
Yes, okay.
25 years.
Yeah, so Lindsay was really disappointed.
Can you repeat that question? Couldn't hear you,
Oh,
Charlie.
yes, I'm sorry. Charlie asked whether Yeats retained that fascination with Lindsay, and I guess whether there was any further correspondence or communication with Lindsay. So because of the war, Lindsay was disappointed that there was not more correspondence and communication. Because of the war, they did not travel. But in 1920, Lindsay went back to Europe to recite at Oxford. But Yeats had an emergency tonsillectomy, so that didn't work out. But in 1937, I think it was, Yeats was doing a series or a program for the BBC called The Poet's Parlor. And on the agenda was 2 poems by Lindsay, The Congo and Booth. They were cut because of time, but they were very important to Yeats, and he was intending to demonstrate that.
Just 2 years before his own death.
Yes, exactly. Professor Brown.
Well, I think that was a great presentation. I learned a lot from that, and I'm sure all of us want to thank you for that. I went to part of my education in St. Louis and Springfield, and I know these places. And when I look at this picture of him, it looks right for Springfield, Illinois, or wherever. But you know, he doesn't have the stance of a Yeats or a Joyce or the taking on this aura of the poet, and so it's hard for, I bet, the audience to be transformed into this Vatic promissory of a glory of the Western, Midwestern United States.
So I guess your question is, what impact did he have on his audience? Was it what he hoped it to be, or was it something else? despite everything I've said about Lindsay, he really was success-driven. And I think he really wanted to prove something to his father and his mother. His father was very unhappy with his choice, but he did fund him nonetheless for a while, and that bothered Lindsay even more. So he was driven to accomplish a position in the world of poetry. Perhaps if he was not so driven, there would be more examples of his genius than there actually was. He was too busy being a success, I think, to really accomplish everything he could have. But frankly, his audience was, I think, more interested in the performance than in the content. And I think that's just the truth of the matter. He got, as I think I said earlier, he got very upset with his audience for constantly demanding those poems that were what he called his high vaudeville poetry. And he even at the end started refusing, or at least trying to refuse, to recite those. In fact, on his last tour before his suicide, he was in Washington, and I think it was because of his refusal to recite those poems, finally giving up and saying, I'm not going to do it, his audience walked out on him. He had already felt that the muse had left him, and when the audience followed, there was just nothing left for him. Yes?
I'm sorry if this comes out of left field, but are you familiar with the Charles Ives setting of Booth? And do you know anything about why it was set? It comes out of left field, I'm sorry.
Why Booth was set in...
By Charles Ives in a song.
I don't know that, sorry. Would you care in a minute or two to enlighten us?
Well, it's an amazing song by Charles Ives. It's the entire thing, and you should listen to it.
Okay. Does it show Booth in the heaven like?
Yes, it does. It's the entire poem.
Oh, great.
And it's very Ivesian. It's very individual, and I'm certain that you need to listen to it.
Well, my question is, did it postdate or predate the poem?
Oh, it was definitely Lindsay's poem.
So the Ives was a takeoff on Lindsay, or Lindsay was a
He
take?
set the poem. Ives set.
And you set the poem to music.
Okay, I got it.
Set it to a song.
Okay. I hear you now.
Very enjoyed presentation, really great. My question is about the Bardic tradition, and especially around memory. I think you said something like the Bardic tradition, these monks or poets would learn like an Iliad and Odyssey 1.5 times the length. Was Lindsay also capable of this, and did he have a recitation of poetry that was similar of just being able to go?
So, to the best of my knowledge, and I think this is a pretty safe assumption, he recited all of his poetry from memory. There's no way he could have been the kind of performer he was, because he really did. It really was an exhaustive exercise when he was reciting. So there's no way he could have had sheets of his poetry before him.
Thanks.
Was he involved in the Chautauqua circuit? I mean, did he intersect with that movement? I'm off on my dates maybe, but
Which movement is this?
the Chautauqua circuit, where they would, people, famous people would go around.
Kennedy asked if he was part of the Chautauqua circuits. No, not that I know of. It never comes up in any of the 3 biographies that I've read. Although his father, his grandfather that he celebrated, did fund the building of Chautauqua grounds, which were originally places to train people for the ministry. Got it? One last one, Holly.
I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
And in all of these, in many of these excerpts that you pulled out for us, I gather this sense of him being very idealistic, but also someone who's going to be disappointed, because like you said, is very much going against the grain of the direction of society, of wealth and industrialization, and people moving out of the small towns. So it just makes me wonder about him sort of, what his kind of personal stance was. Was he towards the world? I mean, was he kind of a reclusive? Was he sort of off in his own? Do you feel that he was sort of off in his own kind of bubble, so to say, or was he?
Well, he was not reclusive. He needed people. There's no question about that. He needed love and romance, even though it was going to be celibate love and romance. And he was disappointed, as I can understand, many times. No, he needed the people. I will say that this image of Lindsay as a pilgrim is something which goes way, way, way back. His earliest poems are poems of wandering. And Edgar Lee Masters, who was also a poet, said that one of his poems, I forget the name of it, but it's a really early poem, probably 1904 or 5, which is a poem of Lindsay as a pilgrim, saying that he has to forsake the love and the family that comes to people who don't undertake this pilgrimage. Is sorrowful to him. And Edgar Lee Masters calls this the most beautiful romantic poet in the English language, which it probably isn't, but Edgar Lee Masters, he's some authority, I guess. So I think he needed people rather than didn't need people. And in the circumstances where he really looks depressed, etc., it's more when he is not being accepted by people or not with people. But one other thing just to mention, and then I'll give up the floor to Anne, is that Johnny Appleseed was Lindsay. Lindsay was out there spreading his seeds, just like Johnny Appleseed. And there's other poems. There's a poem about Lucifer, but he goes in depth to say that it's not the Lucifer of the fall note, but Lucifer also is out there spreading songs and trying to spread songs of a different kind to the world. So he saw himself as that. That was his mission. Okay. Thank you.